why evil seems to be. It's not running rampant. I have control. I have control of all of it, and we'll see this very plainly as we go through here. Now he says, because in them the wrath of God is finished. God says, I'm going to take care of evil. That's a good message, isn't it? You know, I look around, I've told you before, sometimes I get pretty disillusioned when I look around, and particularly this time of the year with some of the political stuff going on, and some of what I consider, use a word that we've talked about here in Revelation, blasphemy that some of these politicians are using. You know, there's one, and I'm not going to get political today, but there's one that I've seen in his own words who declares, oh, God is binary. Non-binary, pardon me. I had to look it up. God is non-binary. What's that mean? What does it mean?
No gender.
Do what?
No gender.
No gender. Now, this old boy is supposed to be a seminary student, unquote. And I'm thinking, you reckon that seminary, they never read the first chapter of Genesis? But I'm thinking, how could you say that? How could you say that? And I think, evil is just getting worse and worse and worse, just like it was the first century. But God promised them, and God promises us, what's going to happen? What's going to happen to evil? It's all going to be destroyed. God's in control. Can you imagine? Can you think about that? Can you imagine? And the scene that we're seeing in heaven right now, when I really get down, I like to look at some of these pictures in Revelation of what heaven's like. Can you imagine a world, an existence with no evil, no ungodliness? Oh, well, these Christians are longing for that, and he's sharing that here. And then in verse 2, we've talked about this before, and I saw something like a sea of glass. Now we're very familiar, we know through not just Revelation, but through all apocalyptic literature, the sea always represented what? Evil. It was always pictured in this apocalyptic literature, secular, non-secular, religious, non-religious, whatever term you want to use. It was always a raging torrent, horrible, frightening. But what did, in his vision, how did John see this scene in heaven with a sea? What does it look like? Glass. Which means what? It's calm. It's peaceful. There's no turbulent aspect to it whatsoever. And why is that? In the presence of God, what happens to evil? It's calmed. It's peaceful. It's tranquil. It's healed. And we see this. And by the way, you think back, we've seen this several times, all the way back in chapter 4. You know, that very first time we have this scene of heaven. Do you remember what the sea was like in chapter 4? Same words, same phrase. A sea of glass, mixed with fire, and those who had been victorious over the beast. Now this would apply to those first century Christians, and guess what? It would apply to us too. How are we victorious over Satan? I'll give you a hint. Revelation 2:10. How are you and I, how are these first century Christians, how would they be victorious over Satan, over evil, over, as he calls it here, the beast, which would include the Roman Empire and all the minions of Satan, then and now? How do we win? We're faithful, very good, be faithful even unto death. You know, to a lot of people, they'd say that's totally illogical. How can we be victorious if evil kills us? How are we victorious? Because we're faithful and our victory is eternal. It's not limited to this short physical life that we have. We are, just like these folks, we're promised these folks, and we've talked all along about the martyrs and how they're pictured as victors. And again, people would say, how could somebody that had been killed for their faith be victors? Well, they are, because they're victors for all eternity. And so these that are victorious over the beast, and the image and the number of his name, a reference back to the evil emperors like Nero, standing on the sea of glass. The sea is not just tranquil and peaceful in front of God. Evil is not. But these people are actually doing what? These saints, these martyrs, if you will. Where are they pictured here in this image? They're on the sea, which is symbolic saying evil is in subjection to God and his people. Well, that's a wonderful concept. And then something we talked about last week as well, holding harps of God. What do we say throughout both apocalyptic and non-apocalyptic literature? What did harps represent? Victory, yeah. And what else? Remember when Saul wanted David to come play the harp, what was the purpose? Calm him down. These Christians now, in the presence of evil that have understandably plagued them and tormented them. And remember we said back in chapter 6, verse 10, they're saying, how long? Well, there's a time that it's all over. And now they're praising God, they're worshiping God, and they're at peace. Again, a promise not just to them 2,000 years ago, but to you and me too, to each and every one of us. And then, verse 3, and they sang the song of Moses. We've run across that before in God's Word, haven't we? Where was the song of Moses? I know y'all know. You're just making sure I do, right? Very, very wise. Make sure the teacher knows what he's talking about. It's Exodus, the 15th chapter. Now, when you say Exodus, what does that tell you? Yeah, these folks, God's people, had been in bondage for 400 years. Where? In Egypt. And do you remember when Moses came, or when God came to Moses in the burning bush? God said, Moses, I have a job for you because I have heard their groaning. I know what's going on. They're going to think about that. God knew in Exodus, in Egypt. God knew in the first century. And God knows today. We've talked about this all the way through Revelation. Does God know the struggles that we as Christians have today? Sure He does. And we go back to Revelation 2:10. You be faithful through those struggles, even if it's the worst thing man can think of, physical death. You be faithful in the death, and I'll give you a crown of righteousness. Okay, they thought about this undoubtedly when he brings up the song of Moses. Does anybody know the occasion in Exodus, the 15th chapter, when Moses offers this song to God? Do you know what's happened? That's exactly right. This is after God has parted the Red Sea and ushered the children of Israel across dry land. Now that in and of itself would have been enough to, I mean, can you imagine that? Can you imagine that you're standing there on the Red Sea and you look over your shoulder and you see these dust clouds rolling in the Sinai Peninsula there? And you know the Pharaoh has changed his mind and he's coming to get you. And you know what he's probably going to do? He's going to wipe out the congregation of Israel. And they're sitting there and God stops them with the cloudy pillar and the fire at night. And he stops them. And that night, the waves part. And you're still saying, it won't do us any good because that seafloor, we can't get through it. And the wind blows, and the seafloor dries up, and God tells Moses, go, go. And the ones that don't want to go, tell them to go anyway. And they get across the Red Sea, and here comes Pharaoh. They're still not out of harm's way. Here comes Pharaoh and his army with chariots, state-of-the-art military force. They come across, and when they get out there in the middle of that Red Sea, what happened? The waves engulfed them. And we're told there in the end of the 14th chapter of Exodus that the Egyptian soldiers are washing up on the seashore. He has completely destroyed the Egyptian army, what they thought was going to destroy them. And then Moses lifts up what we call this Song of Moses. And if you're familiar with, we get a little excerpt of it here. It is a song of deliverance. It's a song of victory. It's a song of vindication. I mean, it's a song of jubilation that I try to put myself there, standing on the Red Sea, seeing what's left of Pharaoh's army washing up on shore, and knowing unequivocally who did that. God did. And he's saying that, and like I said, these people know that story. They know that what had happened. They knew that God had taken care of the children of Israel all the way back in Egypt. And he had delivered them from bondage. He delivered them from slavery. He delivered them from oppression. Much like what they're dealing with. And if you look at this song, great and marvelous are your works, O Lord God the Almighty. Righteous and true are your ways, King of the nations. Now, there's two ancient manuscripts where it says nations right there, have put ages in there. Why would that be further consolation and comfort to these first century Christians? And why would it help us today? It says that he's the Lord of the nations, the Lord of the ages. Perfect. He did that with the children of Israel, leading them out of bondage and oppression and slavery in Egypt. And he's saying, those first century Christians, I'm going to do the same thing with you. He did it past, present, and future. What a great way to put it. How about for us? What does that say to us? God's still going to do it. God's still going to do it just like that. And then if you look at the next verse 4, who will not fear, O Lord, and glorify your name? For you alone are holy. And then we have a quotation from the Old Testament. For all the nations will come and worship before you, for your righteous acts have been revealed. That's from Jeremiah, the 10th chapter. Now let's think back. To whom did Jeremiah prophesy? Very good. Yes, he prophesied to God's people. They had abandoned God, and he said, come back and you'll be okay. You stay away, you're on your own. And they stayed away. And what nation came in and conquered them? Babylon. Very good. And the prophecy of Jeremiah was not just to the Jewish people, but it was also about Babylon. And what did God say to these people? I'm going to do with evil. Same thing we've talked about all along. I will take care of it. God used Babylon to eventually bring the Jews back to him. He said, you're going through this oppression, this bondage, this slavery. But those who are faithful and come back to me, I'll take care of you. That's always been God's promise. You know, literally from the Garden of Eden till today. It was in the first century. It was with Jeremiah. And I find it fascinating here. He goes, in effect, a thumbnail sketch of history with God's people. Goes back to Egypt, and then he comes to Babylonian captivity, and now it's Roman oppression. And the message is always, always, always the same, which ought to give us a whole lot of confidence today. God is still in control, and God still knows what we're dealing with, and God says, I promise I'll take care of it for all eternity. Do you understand how that would affect these Christians that are hurting so badly in the first century? You understand how that'll help us today when we get down and discouraged and despondent about where we see evil running rampant today? Well, then he goes on, verse 5. And after these things I looked. And then he brings in a couple more Old Testament images here. The temple of the tabernacle of testimony. The temple of the tabernacle of testimony. What was the tabernacle? In the history of God's people, the Hebrews, what did the tabernacle represent? Very good. In the wilderness, you know, they have a tent and there's a tabernacle. And what's in the tabernacle? You remember? Ark of the Covenant's in the tabernacle. And what did that represent? Symbolically, what did the tabernacle, when they were wandering through the wilderness for 40 years, what did the tabernacle represent? God's presence among his people. I mean, it was holy. That's where God, they knew that even in their affliction in the wilderness, which they brought on because of their own lack of faith, God was still there. God was still there. And think when they're in the wilderness, how did God take care of them? He fed them. He fed them manna. He clothed them. You know, their clothes didn't wear out. He took care of every aspect of their life. Even in their affliction, God was there. Now, what did the temple represent? Same thing. Same thing. You know, in the temple, the Holy of Holies, that was symbolically the presence of God with his people. God was with his people. But I want you to look now when he makes reference to the tabernacle and the temple of testimony in heaven. Now, right now, historically, what is the status of the tabernacle in first century Israel? Doesn't exist, does it? Physically, it does not exist. How about the temple? In AD 95, when Revelation is written, what's the status of the temple that was, of course, where was the temple physically located? It was in Jerusalem. What kind of condition is the temple right now in AD 95? It's destroyed. The Romans took care of that in AD 70. They had obliterated the land of Israel. So I'm sure that some eyebrows were raised when he gets down and he gets talking about the tabernacle. John, that was Old Testament. And the temple, we hadn't had a temple in 25 years because the Romans have destroyed it. But now when he talks about the temple and the tabernacle, again, this is symbolic. This is his vision. Where are they? They're in heaven. So what does that tell you? Keep in mind the symbolism of the tabernacle and the symbolism of the temple. What's he saying right here with that line? God's in heaven, and in this vision, where are the people? The martyrs, the faithful. You see, God had come to be in the presence of people, but now the people are in the presence of God. And they're all in this blissful, beautiful, peaceful environment where there is no longer any evil. Now think about that just a second. Can you imagine the peace and the comfort and the solace that brings these people after all that we've talked about with which they're dealing? And now they're assured. And you know, there's a passage we'll get to a little bit later. I usually like to read at a memorial service, a funeral service, where it talks about what heaven's like. And we all know it. What in his next vision of heaven, how's John see heaven? I mean, just generically speaking, how do we describe, if you were asked to describe heaven, how would you describe it? And a whole bunch of it comes from Revelation right here. I'm sorry? Streets of gold, which we know that that's symbolic, but talking precious. Yes, sir.
Describing heaven, to me, it's beyond our comprehension.
Good point. I don't think we get, there's any way, and I think that's the reason that John in Revelation and a lot of other references to heaven are symbolic. We just can't we can't wrap our minds around it. No more tears, no more sorrow, no more parting, no more death. You start thinking about all the things that plague us in this life and all the things that plague these people. And now we see this vision that I think you're 100% right. We can't fully understand it. I mean, we can describe it in human verbiage as closely as we can, but we don't even get a glimpse of what heaven's like. And he's sharing that with these folks. And now, like we say, God's people are in God's presence. And they don't have to worry about the Roman Empire anymore. They don't have to worry about the Babylonians anymore, the Assyrians anymore, the Medo-Persians anymore, or the Greeks anymore. They're in God's presence, and it's beautiful. And then verse 6, he gives us a very distinct picture, a preview, if you will, of what we're going to start seeing in chapter 16. To get back to the original, they've been waiting to hear, okay, God, what's your plan of dealing with this evil? He says, and the 7 angels who had the 7 plagues came out of the temple, clothed in linen, clean and bright, and girded around their chests with golden sashes. Now that last phrase doesn't mean anything to us, but it meant something to them, because this pretty well described the attire of the chief priest in the Old Testament. And so it was saying that, again, God's people, that's where they are. And they're in the presence of the Almighty God. Verse 7. Then one of the 4 living creatures gave to the 7 angels 7 golden bowls full of the wrath of God who lives forever and ever. Maybe we ought to stop for just a second and review. What symbolically did we say the 4 living creatures, what did we say that represented? Way back there in chapter 4. What was this? I mean, it has this symbolic picture, this 4 living creatures with eyes all around and wings. And what we talked about, we saw that in other apocalyptic literature. And I know it still resonates after all these 11 chapters that are in between.
It's like Egypt and Babylon and Persia.
Okay, that's a good guess. That's a good guess. There you go. It described God's holiness. You remember we've talked about many times. In fact, Carlin brought this up in our Wednesday night class, I think 2 weeks ago. We oftentimes describe God in three phrases or terms. Omnipotent, which means what? All powerful. And these 4 living creatures back in chapter 4 were described in just such a way that nothing could touch them. And then we talk about omniscience. What's omniscience? All-knowing, all-seeing. And you remember these 4 living creatures, they had eyes all around their heads. And then we talked about being omnipresent. What's omnipresent? Everywhere. And because they had these wings, we talked about the fact that based on some other apocalyptic literature that we'd seen, we talked about that at the time. This talks about the holiness of God, the righteousness of God, the power of God, the might of God, the wisdom of God. Now, why would that come into play right here? Do you think that any of these Christians in that first century had doubts in their minds about what's going on in their environment? You know, we've seen that. How long is this going on? Why is this going on? What's this saying about this beautiful aspect of God, all-powerful, all-knowing, ever-present? What's the message? He's in control. Very good. He's totally in control. And we've seen in not so many words, but we've seen the message all through Revelation. Be patient. God's going to take care of it because he has all power. He can overcome anything evil Satan throws at you. He's all-knowing. He has all wisdom. He knows what's best. You ever had anything in your life and you didn't understand it at the time? And then later on, you thought, I'm sure glad it didn't work the way I wanted it to. There's no doubt God's in control. He knows a whole lot better than I do. And then he's everywhere. He's omnipresent. Again, what we've really seen through a whole lot of chapter 15, he's here all along. One of my, let's say, that clock is, something they fixed the clock. Did y'all know that? It's only a few minutes off now. And before it's like 15 minutes off. Wow. One of my favorite John Wayne movies. I know that shocks you that I like John Wayne. But one of my favorite John Wayne movies was the old movie Chisholm, which is very, very loosely based on what was called the Lincoln County Wars in New Mexico in the 1870s. And it's Billy the Kid, Pat Garrett, all the famous or infamous Old West characters. And at the very end of the movie, the girl that plays John Wayne's niece, which again is loosely based on history, she says, I am so glad that this war is over. And John Wayne's sidekick, who was Ben Johnson, that made a jillion movies with the Duke, he says, I don't know, Miss Sally. He said, let's see if I can phrase it. There's an old saying that there is no law west of Dodge, and there's no God west of the Pecos. And he says, right, Mr. Chisholm, who's John Wayne, and he says, wrong, Mr. Pepper. And I try to keep this in mind. He said, because wherever people, pardon me, chokes me up, wherever people go, the law eventually falls. And when they get there, they realize God's already been there. I love that statement because there are times, I confess there have been times in my life that I may not have verbalized it, but I hate to confess it, but I thought, God, where are you? You think these first century Christians might have been thinking that at the same time? God, where are you? In the message in chapter 15, I'm right here. I'm in control. And when time is right, I'll take care of it. And we're fixed to see this picture of how God is going to ultimately take care of evil in chapter 16. Questions or comments, anybody? You didn't know you were going to get a cinematic review of John Wayne when you came this morning, did you? I'm sorry? Okay, it was bonus, Kathy said. Well, we're going to stop right there because I understand the fellow that's preaching today, his voice is pretty weak. And so he's going to stop a few minutes early to rest his voice. And then, Lord willing, he'll have enough voice to get through. And, I oftentimes tell people, and this is... I hadn't done this a long time, taught class and then preached a sermon, but I used to tell people, I'd ask you to pray for my voice, but I'm not sure how you'd pray. But either way, we're going to go ahead and stop right there today, and we're going to pick up in chapter 16, Lord willing, next Sunday morning. Thank you very much.